Welcome back to Capital H, the podcast where we explore the latest trends and developments to make the work better for humans and humans better at work. I'm your host, David Mallon. I'm a managing director in Deloitte's human capital practice in the US, and I'm chief analyst for our Insights to Action research and sensing team. Today, we're going to dive into another trend from our 2024 Global Human Capital Trends report, the trend on beyond productivity. We all know the world of work today is different from the past. Organizations need to begin to make strides to thrive in a work environment that is increasingly human. A big piece of this puzzle is understanding human performance and how organizations should measure it. The once clear line that linked individual worker activity, kind of where we spend our time, how much time we spend on doing whatever we do, to tangible outcomes is blurred, replaced by an ever more complex network of collaborations and demands for more sophisticated skills that aren't really easily observed by traditional activity or productivity metrics. And in this era of human-centered work, new sources of data and artificial intelligence tools and so on, these can actually be a help to organizations to make this shift, to measure something more than activity, to actually capture or begin to capture something that gets to the value that the humans actually bring to the organization, to actually measure human performance. We have two segments for you today, an interview, and then, of course, our leader roundtable. In our first segment, we'll be joined by Sue Cantrell. She is our human capital eminence leader in the US. And Travis Dion, he is with WalkMe. They're going to discuss the importance of moving beyond productivity, some of the challenges with that, and maybe how to navigate them. Sue and Travis, take it away.
My name is Sue Cantrell. I lead human capital eminence and thought leadership for Deloitte, and I am one of the authors of Deloitte's 2024 Global Human Capital Trends report. I am thrilled to be joined today by Travis Dion from WalkMe to discuss one of our trends from this year's report, Beyond Productivity. Travis, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Can you introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a bit about what you do and what your organization does?
Sure, Sue. Thanks for having me here today. So again, my name is Travis Dion. I'm the Vice President of Alliances and Channels at WalkMe. I lead our global ecosystem team, which includes our strategic Deloitte relationship and the great work that we do together with our clients. WalkMe pioneered a new software category called the Digital Adoption Platform, or DAP for short. We saw that software was becoming a big part of nearly every job, and users were having a hard time keeping up. So 11 years ago, we created a solution to help address this growing problem. Using the WalkMe platform, companies can better navigate the constant change that's brought on by technology. Our customers increase their effectiveness and reduce risk by ensuring consistent and efficient adoption of all the software that they buy. They use AI, we use AI, and we sit on top of an organization's existing tech stack to identify where people experience friction. Then we deliver the guidance and automation needed to get their job done, right in the flow of their work. It's all about helping humans better use the technology they depend on more and more every day in their jobs.
Thank you, Travis. Just wanted to chat with you today about one of our trends that we've introduced in this year's Global Human Capital Trends report. It's really the concept around moving beyond traditional productivity metrics. When we think about it, we're really in an era of human-centered work, and there's now a need for organizations to shift from measuring employee productivity to measuring what we at Deloitte call human performance. And we define this as business outcomes and human outcomes, and then their multiplier effect or reinforcing effect on one another. So Travis, my first question to you, what are the challenges or problems do you see with traditional productivity metrics, and why might organizations need to think about moving beyond those?
Well, the traditional productivity metrics that we often see are things that are like inputs or outputs that are pretty easy to measure. So number of calls completed, the time it takes to complete a transaction, total number of hours worked, or the number of cases resolved. And these can be easy to measure, and it's pretty natural to assume that they'll lead to the outcomes that you want in the business, like profitability or great NPS score, higher customer satisfaction. And so these metrics were effective when we were in an industrial era of work. In the manufacturing world, assembly lines where people were making widgets and things like that. Innovation and speed and other intangibles are more valued today as opposed to those traditional counting metrics that we saw in the industrial era. So they're less relevant, and activity metrics don't always correlate to whether or not value is being created in the business. So if we're tracking customer satisfaction for a call center and we're evaluating how many calls a rep can make in a day, the number of calls doesn't necessarily mean that our customers are happy. The number of calls is not a strong value metric. It's a metric, but it doesn't really indicate value. So the quality of customer service provided by reps in those calls is a better indicator of customer sat. And that's why we think more about the human performance rather than the more traditional old school productivity metrics of counting inputs and outputs.
I love that, Travis. Thank you for that. We're thinking about why traditional productivity metrics don't necessarily help organizations move towards that focus on outcomes or value when we're focused on inputs or activities, which is where traditional productivity metrics have traditionally gone. So just stepping back, what should organizations be measuring instead of traditional inputs and activities in order to measure value or outcomes?
So from our perspective at WalkMe, we see that many of these human performance measurements can actually be tied back to fostering skill development in the people. And so we use behavior-based analytics to baseline and benchmark a common business process and uncover where the skills might be lacking and where workers may need system support to improve the way that they complete a process. We can visualize how people are using technology throughout a process and measure things like the human errors, where the user drops out of that process or delays the process or abandons it altogether during the same period of time, or when they employ a workaround and use something outside of the process that we've designed. And using those insights, we can then design guidance inside the application to bring the learning into the flow of the user's work. And so now we're upskilling the user and making sure that they successfully complete their process, complete their workflow. And that's what's driving the real value for the business. So behavior-based measurements, rather than just focusing on what is being done, we like to focus on how it's being done, or maybe what's not being done. So as an example, we have a hardware customer in the technology space that was losing closed deals after the sale because the installation service wasn't set up properly. And WalkMe helped them identify that that process was never properly started, or it was inputted incorrectly, or there wasn't a person assigned to it. And as a result, those orders were getting canceled. And we tracked it back to that problem around the inputs. And we used insights to figure out how many reps were doing this and how big of a problem this was. And then using that data, we designed prompts to encourage the sales rep to fill this out properly and show them how to do it right in the flow of work with proper quality. We automated some parts of it, and then we gamified it to correct the behavior across all of the reps in the organization and get them doing the right things. And this gave us visibility in each step around not just the output, which was creating quotes, but the quality of the behaviors that went into creating those quotes. And we were able to increase their quote quality and the compliance in this process by 49%. So that's an example of behavior-based measurements. Competency-based measurements, again, is the ability to perform a specific task or a skill, to have a competency. And so we've worked with a large insurance company where they have a lot of problems with misquoting policies, and that leads to a lot of lost revenue for them. So we can go in, we can see where the friction is in that process and identify where there maybe is a skill gap, that someone doesn't know how to do part of that process, or they're not doing it right. And the tool can measure if they're stuck on a page and they're waiting there for a long time, or they tried several times to input something and they kept getting it wrong. We can detect that. And so we can identify that skill gap, that lack of understanding, and then help that user with personalized guidance right in the flow of work. And for one of the insurance companies we did this for, we decreased the number of missed quotes by over 200,000 in the first year. So we can have a really big impact by looking at behavior-based measurements and competency-based measurements.
Thank you for sharing such specific examples. It really brings it to life, Travis. One of the core definitions of human performance is not only kind of the business side, but the human side, the human outcomes. And in our trends report, we spend a lot of time setting up the scene around prioritizing what we call human sustainability. And really, we define it as the degree to which an organization creates value for people as human beings. So, for example, leaving them with greater health and well-being, or stronger skills and greater employability and good jobs and opportunities for advancement, greater equity, heightened feelings of belonging and purpose. So when we think about combining a focus on business outcomes with a focus on human outcomes, that enables organizations to achieve what we call human performance, this mutually reinforcing cycle of kind of shared value for both workers, organizations, and society. So Question for you, Travis. Do you have examples you can share around the value here for workers and for people? And maybe you have some examples around how technology like WalkMe's is enabling organizations to help create value for humans.
Sure. It's a long time saying that the humans that work at a company are the most important asset that they have. And that's never been more true today, where so many employees are, as knowledge workers, how important understanding the business processes and all the things that they're responsible for in the business is so critical. So we think a lot about helping employees build sustainable careers, onboarding them quickly, but constantly upskilling them so that they can navigate all these new technologies. And so we have a problem with forecasting. We have to find a new forecasting tool. We have a problem with response time and support. We need a new piece of software and support. So as humans working in the business, we're constantly getting new software thrown at us. And we have to develop skills and navigate that change on an ongoing basis. So we use the WalkMe software to help, again, monitor the way people using the software that has been provided to them, but also help make it easier to use and help them adapt it right inside the flow of their work. So this is really valuable for people because they don't have to spend as much time learning applications. Nobody wants to learn a new software application. They'd rather spend their time doing the complex tasks that people are really needed for and doing more fulfilling human-centric activity rather than inputting data. We also help them keep up with this rapid pace of change that I was talking about. Generative AI has created a whole bunch of change super fast in the past 12, 18 months. That started showing up in the business. So workers are trying to adapt and adopt these new technologies at an even faster pace than they've ever seen before. So workers that can accomplish their jobs effectively, absorb this new technology effectively, they can have a greater sense of purpose and well-being in their jobs. We talked about insurance earlier. And so we have insurance companies that, again, see inconsistency when creating policies. And that leads to payment issues. It leads to customers calling in that are confused and not having great experience. And employees have to spend time solving for that, preventing churn on coverage and policies. And so our client wanted to improve the agent's skill set so that they could get better business outcomes in this area. And so by better guiding the agents, understanding where they're having problems, and then improving the user experience for them, we could train them on a skill set of better understanding how to write the policy. So they can look at what assets need to be covered and get that done accurately. They can assess the risk factors and the potential hazards that may be part of this policy. And so that training can happen right inside the application itself. And we can proactively identify where common mistakes are made, calculating a premium or calculating the deductibles. And all of this leads to getting the correct policy out the door. And this makes the agents more fulfilled in the job that they're doing. They're preventing errors. Nobody likes to make mistakes. And then it also allows them to focus on other tasks. And ultimately, this reduces the amount of stress that they have in their workday. They're more effective, they're happier, and companies are able to retain their employees when they're feeling fulfilled and satisfied in their job.
Thank you, Travis. The tangible examples really help bring it to life. One of the things we wrote about across all of our trends, but in particular this one, was that this shift to thinking about human performance rather than just traditional employee productivity, it really calls for a major mindset shift, right, across workers and organizations alike. And we know, of course, that mindset shifts and changes are much easier said than done. So, Travis, what is your perspective? What's keeping others from making the shift toward looking at human performance rather than productivity? And why aren't we already measuring elements of human performance?
Well, like anything, change is always hard. But in this case in particular, the old way of measuring productivity was pretty easy to measure. You can count calls, you can count support tickets resolved, you can count things that have been produced or how many hours people work. That stuff's really easy to track and to count. We've gotten really good at it. But human performance metrics are more challenging, and really understanding what the drivers are that improve the business performance and how it ties back to the humans that are performing them, that's a harder thing to do. And things like happiness or purpose or well-being, skills and competencies, these things are not as easy to count. And you really have to dig deep into the business to understand them and to measure them. And so I think we're all starting to experiment with new measures and trying to get more human-centric and thinking about human performance. But we're still tied to a lot of these old productivities, inputs and outputs that we've been used to for decades. So the other problem is that you just don't know what you don't know, right? And you can't sit with every employee and watch the process that they go through to do certain tasks and to get things done. And so when you only measure the productivity of the inputs or the outputs, it's really hard to get the whole picture of what's happening to get to those points and to properly diagnose what's wrong and how you can improve the business outcomes. Organizations that start by identifying the outcome first, and then they work backwards to determine what human elements contribute to that outcome can have better success. And technology has become embedded in all of these processes. So it's not just looking at the human, it's looking at how is the human working with the technology to get to that outcome. So from our standpoint, we believe the power in building skills and skill development and continuing to validate with clients the impact and striving to create learning right in the flow of work that seamlessly enables people to upskill on the job is critically important. And some of the examples that we went through today show you how the combination of people and technology and making that process as efficient, as effective as possible can directly impact the business through better service, better profitability, better compliance, but also directly impacts the people and ensuring that they're enjoying their work, they're being as effective as possible, they're learning on the job, in the flow of work, and they're satisfied with what they're doing.
Travis, this has been such an insightful conversation. We've talked kind of big theory. You've shared some very tangible real world examples today. And I'd just like to take this back to today to end us off and wanted to ask you, what are the top 3 things you can suggest organizations do today to start on this journey to new human performance metrics?
So first, I think everyone needs to recognize how important technology and even more importantly, people's ability to use that technology effectively, how important that is in their daily work today, in every workforce, in every industry, all over the world. Technology is embedded in all of this. Number 2, try to sort of switch your mindset from how can I improve my people's productivity to maybe how can I foster the right skill development and improve human performance and get away from counting the inputs and outputs that we did in the old days and think a little bit more deeply about the human performance that's involved in getting to those outcomes. And then third, consider how can you strategically use technology and things like analytics to help look at the way people are doing their jobs, to help inspect people's behavior while they're completing processes so you can identify those skills gaps and help them right in the flow of work and ultimately improve the business processes that you're after. So those are the 3 things that I would recommend.
Thank you, Travis. And thank you, listeners, for joining us.
Thank you, Sue and Travis. Now, to continue our conversation, it's time for our roundtable. I'm joined by a few of my Deloitte colleagues and co-authors of this year's Global Human Capital Trends Report. Let's get started. Welcome back, listeners. Let's get started. I am joined by 3 of my Deloitte colleagues, Diane Sinti, Julie Duda, and Sue Cantrell. First, Diane, she is part of our human capital practice. She's our future of work leader. She's focused on work redesign and talent optimization. She and her teams enable complex global organizations to future-proof and maintain competitive advantage through a focus on value-based outcomes, optimizing human and machine collaboration and their reimagination of work, workforce, and workplace. Julie Duda is a human capital insights lead in our Insights to Action research practice, and she's one of our authors of this year's Global Human Capital Trends. And Sue Cantrell, she's our human capital eminence leader for Deloitte Consulting's human capital practice, and she is also one of our authors of this year's Global Human Capital Trends. Welcome, Diane, Julie, and Sue.
It's a pleasure to be here today.
Likewise. Thanks, David.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, to start us off, I want to dig into why organizations need to move beyond traditional productivity metrics. What's driving this trend? Why doesn't traditional productivity measure work as a way to measure work anymore? Diane, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thanks, David. Well, the once clear line that linked individual worker activity, such as hours worked or calls completed, to tangible outcomes, such as customer satisfaction or commercial potential of research and development projects, is now blurred. It's replaced by a complex network of collaborations and a demand for sophisticated skills that aren't easily observed or measured by traditional productivity metrics. Even in frontline, logistics, and manufacturing environments, where traditional metrics like minutes per call or widgets produced may seem most applicable, technology and AI are being increasingly used to automate such tasks. Now, the workforce can then be free to undertake complex problem solving that requires skills that are less technical and more abstract, such as creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. At the same time, some organizations are looking beyond traditional metrics such as revenues and profits to consider how they can create shared value, outcomes that benefit individual workers, teams, and groups, the organization, and even society as a whole. The organizations that successfully navigate this new environment will likely be the ones who make the shift from old methods of understanding productivity to embracing something that we're calling human performance, which we'll talk about in a bit.
Sue, so building off from what Diane has just teed up, why is this trend relevant from your perspective? What are the main drivers you're seeing? Maybe even go a bit further on this notion of human performance.
Sure, David. So I'm just going to take us back in history for a little bit. Think about it. Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we have measured productivity, and it's literally defined as output per hour or net output. So when we think about traditional productivity metrics, they're activity-centric, right? Focused on inputs and outputs rather than outcomes. So we measure productivity at looking at things like time on task or revenue per employee or inputs and outputs. The issue is it only reflects the perspective of the organization and not the human outcomes of workers. And it's all rooted in historical constructs of mechanization, mass production, the assembly line, and it really hasn't changed since then. Yet, obviously, as Diane just pointed out, the world of work has changed significantly since the 1870s. When it worked well, when economies were focused on scaling production of physical goods, and today our work is more complex, more fluid, more human-focused than ever before, creating the need to shift from oftentimes overly simplistic and potentially outdated measures of employee productivity to measuring what we call human performance. This is defined as measuring those joint human and business outcomes together and how they multiply and reinforce one another. I think about one of the drivers here of being able to go beyond productivity metrics, and I think it's the tech revolution. We have all this influx of new data at our fingertips. It's unprecedented, and we can now enable us to measure these human and business outcomes rather than inputs and outputs. So a fun stat from our research from the Human Capital Trends Report is that 74% of respondents in our survey said it's very or critically important to seek better ways to measure worker performance and their value beyond traditional productivity. But only 17% of respondents said their organization is very or extremely effective at evaluating the value created by individual workers in the organization beyond tracking of activities or outputs. So obviously, there's a lot of data for organizations to leverage, and the issue is, how do you use it? What do you choose to focus on? Organizations need to use new data and new technologies to measure what they should, not just what they can, right? And so when I say new sources of data, think about workplace tools and technologies like email and collaboration platform data, or organization network analysis to measure connections and collaboration across an organization, or sensors and connected devices like wearables or biometric sensing tools, or even AI-enabled voice or audio analytics generated from worker interactions with machines and AI as they work.
Julie, what's your perspective here?
I think one of the things we have to talk about is, why are we not doing it? What are the challenges and blockers that are keeping organizations tied to traditional and less useful metrics for performance? And there's really 4 things. First, there's pressure from external stakeholders. Despite their desire to find better ways to measure human performance, many senior leaders are currently under pressure to demonstrate improved productivity and efficiency based on concerns about high inflation, shrinking profit margins, and the potential for economic recession. This leads to a focus on achieving short-term bottom-line results instead of more strategic business outcomes, let alone human outcomes. For example, improved worker well-being that are less tangible. Secondly, there's uncertainty about what to measure. Many organizations are adrift in an ocean of data, as their ability to collect data outpaces their ability to analyze and act on it. As a result, they may end up with too much data and too little insight, leaving leaders unsure about what metrics are most important and which actions are truly driving performance. Third is productivity paranoia. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many organizations were quick to adopt new worker monitoring tools to track keystrokes, mouse activity, and more, focused on the same productivity standards they'd always tracked. Now, some organizations are finding themselves at odds with their workers over this increased monitoring. And in some cases, there's a real breakdown of trust, rather than having the conversation about what effective performance looks like in today's work environment. And lastly, there's a lack of visibility into outcomes. Many organizations are still focused on measuring worker inputs and outputs rather than outcomes. As organizations begin to measure human performance, they can begin tracking two areas: business outcomes that create value for the organization, and human sustainability or human outcomes, both of which may vary by workforce.
Thanks to all three of you. It's very evident that there are a lot of possibilities here. There's obviously an unprecedented volume of work and workforce and worker data that organizations have available to them. But this does raise another fundamental question. If traditional productivity metrics are perhaps not all that we need or becoming less relevant, what should organizations be measuring to assess human performance? Julie, I'll stick with you.
Well, it's a great question, David. And in order to figure out the answer, first, organizations really need to make a bit of a mindset shift. Traditional mindsets assume that organizations can prioritize either human outcomes or business outcomes, but never both at the same time. And that traditional mindset tends to value business outcomes over those human outcomes. In the current world of work and going forward from this point, this no longer works. To illustrate the new mindset needed, we've created an equation showing how human outcomes can multiply business outcomes and vice versa, together to drive human performance. Human outcomes and business outcomes combined equal human performance in a mutually reinforcing cycle. Why? It's human beings more than any physical or technological assets. It's the humans that truly drive organizations forward today. The potential impact here is real. Our analysis shows the multiplier effects for both business and human outcomes. Organizations that have made this shift are 1.7 times more likely to achieve desired business outcomes and 1.9 times more likely to achieve positive human outcomes. As organizations look to both shape and adapt to the ever-evolving future of work, prioritizing human performance will be key to building an organization that can thrive today and tomorrow.
So, build off of what Julie's talking about here. In order to understand this need to focus on both human and business outcomes, what does this mean for measuring productivity?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to start with alluding back to something Julie talked about earlier. The reality is we're witnessing this exponential growth in the ability to collect data. The issue is some organizations find themselves absolutely lost when the collection of data outpaces its analysis and ability to be useful, right? So more data doesn't automatically equal better results. So organizations really need to be asking what they can track, what data they can collect, but rather what they should track and why. So it's not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but what outcomes do we want to measure and what data would allow us to measure them? So organizations are just starting to bridge that gap. They're moving away from measurement for the sake of measurement to an in-depth analysis of human performance, business and human outcomes multiplied. So a little more than half, about 53% of our respondents in our survey agreed that their organization is in the early phases of identifying better ways to measure worker performance and value. And there's a big opportunity for growth in this area, since only 8% say their organizations are even leading in this area. So to make this a little bit more tangible, let me share a couple representative metrics from our two main buckets of that human performance equation: business outcomes and human outcomes. So when we think about business outcomes, again, different than activities or inputs and outputs, we think about things like customer satisfaction, like Net Promoter Score, things like efficiency or growth and profitability or innovation or speed, like time to market or quality. When we think about human outcomes, it's all about creating value for the person as a human being. So think about things like the ability for people to learn new skills, which can enable them to be more employable or to have opportunities to advance into good jobs, equitable wages, equity and belonging, happiness, physical and psychological safety, purpose and meaning, well-being, and the list goes on.
Dan, what does all this actually look like, though, in the real world? Do you have examples in your client work you can share or in the research we've done that would help make this a little bit more real or more tangible?
Oh, absolutely, David. I'd like to share what Hitachi, a Japanese tech company, is doing. Several years ago, Hitachi set out to improve organizational productivity and efficiency. And to do so, they decided to experiment with an unconventional approach. Instead of trying to squeeze more work out of an hour or shortening production processes, Hitachi focused on tracking a single, unexpected metric: worker happiness. This is exactly the core of Beyond Productivity. Using wearables and a mobile app, Hitachi offered participating workers artificial intelligence-based suggestions for increasing feelings of happiness throughout the day by boosting psychological capital, which is self-confidence and motivation, psychological safety, and alignment with management objectives. So what were the results? Worker psychological capital rose 33%, particularly meaningful given that increased psychological capital results in increased worker engagement, greater job satisfaction, and a lower turnover and burnout. Now, profits increased 10%. Sales per hour at call centers increased 34%, and retail sales increased 15%. What's more, the majority of participants said that they were happy, just one indication that the key to unlocking organizational performance in an era of rapidly evolving work may no longer be tied to traditional productivity metrics. You can see that creating value at the individual worker level led to value at the enterprise level, increasing both revenues and profits. Now, this is not a zero-sum game. Organizational initiatives that were originally designed to achieve benefits like higher cost savings or improved quality can also help amplify worker satisfaction and performance.
So I love the Hitachi example. I love just the notion that happiness matters to performance. It seems so sort of commonsensical, but for an organization to do that, it's such a great example. I want to build off of it. So I'm going to do a quick round robin with all three of you. As organizations consider making this shift using work and workforce data to measure human performance, what are some steps that they can take now that helps them lay a foundation for a shift towards human outcomes and human performance metrics? Julie, let's start with you.
Yes. One that really means a lot to me is co-create metrics and solutions with workers. This can mean a lot of things, but here's one example. I know a leader in a manufacturing plant where they wanted to implement wearable devices to monitor where every worker was in the plant every single second, both to find efficiencies in workflows and patterns of working, but also to enable the automatic shutoff of equipment when someone stepped into a danger zone. I mentioned earlier that monitoring workers too closely can erode trust. In this case, management pulled together a group of workers to help create the guidelines for the use of this technology and its data to ensure that it was being used to improve both business and worker outcomes. Another step organizations can take kind of comes right off of that one. Measure what you should, not just what you can. Your measurements should be focused on outcomes. For example, call center workers are typically measured on call duration or closed out cases per hour. Taking a human performance lens and using technologies like AI to capture new metrics, this could expand to include business outcome metrics like customer satisfaction or upselling, as well as human outcome metrics like skills development and employability, belonging, or retention.
Yeah, Julie, I might add on to that. I love your examples. I think one of the things that I suggest organizations do is to, beyond just measuring human and business outcomes, think about implementing these metrics and your practices in your performance management approach or other processes within the talent lifecycle. So I'll give you an example here. Today, AI can help us collect data, right? I'll give you a couple of examples. It can detect skills and what people are learning to measure the development and growth in people's skills, which is a human outcome. Or AI can listen in on a call center's worker to detect how satisfied the customer is and how much upselling a customer service representative is doing. And these metrics can help inform more fact-based performance reviews. With the rise of generative AI, it can summarize and synthesize multiple sources of data to just help take a little bit of that bias out of performance reviews and create a little bit more objectivity. Diane, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Sue. I think it's really important to think about how we work with AI. Establishing responsible data and AI practices to give workers input on how their individual data is shared across an organization and to ensure compliance with evolving global regulatory requirements. Analysis from our quantified organizational research suggests that trust in an organization's approach to data management raises the probability of improved business growth by about 50%. So plan now to address tensions around the use of emerging technologies. Our quantified organizational research also showed that workers are relatively comfortable with data collection from known technologies like email, calendars, and other traditional technologies. They are far less comfortable when it comes to data captured from emerging technologies like wearables.
So I think we'll start to wrap up now. I want to thank, first off, all of you for joining me today. It's such an important conversation. That said, what would you leave to our listeners as parting thoughts? Diane?
Well, when we maximize what people can do, we expand what business can do, creating value for employees, employers, and the communities that they serve.
Julie?
Really, I love the fact that in a world where data and technology seem more and more to be the keys to success, the human part of the equation is more important than ever.
And Sue?
Yeah, so I think about this rapid march of the advances in technology and how it's opening this door. It's an unprecedented opportunity to shift away from those productivity metrics that were born in the industrial era that may no longer be fit for purpose in the new world of work, so that we can truly measure outcomes, both human and business outcomes, and multiply the value they create by that mutual reinforcing interplay between business and human outcomes.
That sounds to me like an absolutely perfect place to end today's conversation. Again, thanks to the three of you for joining us and to you listeners. That brings us to the end of today's episode of Capital H. I want to extend my thanks to our guest, Travis Dion, for joining us today. And of course, to my fellow Deloitte colleagues and co-authors of this year's Human Capital Trend Study for their invaluable contributions as well. To thrive in this increasingly complex work environment, it's obvious that organizations and workers are going to need a culture of performance metrics, of course, tailored to their own unique demands, their local teams, et cetera, but aligned with their overall goals as organizations. Shifting from traditional productivity measures to something that gets at a more comprehensive understanding of human performance is going to be key. As we've discussed today, this is likely involving using new data, new tools, and innovative ways to get at human performance, while at the same time maintaining and building trust with the workforce around that new data and how it's going to be used. Finding better ways, more strategic ways to tie what the worker's doing to business and human outcomes. Thanks, listeners, again for tuning in to Capital H. We hope that you found today's conversation valuable. And we look forward to seeing you next time as we continue to explore topics and trends that put humans at the center of work. If you want to know more about our human capital trends research, you can find the full report at Deloitte.com/HCTrends. Let us know what you think of Capital H, rate us on whatever service you find us, and look us up on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time. This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to Deloitte.com/about.